welcome to the Conservation Efforts Database webinar. My name is Leif Wickman with the Fish and Wildlife Service. This is the third of a three-part series of webinars developed for the Nevada Collaborative Conservation Network. The purpose of these webinars are to capture the content and conversations that took place during an in-person workshop that we held in Reno on April 18th, 2019. Unfortunately, due to some technical difficulties, that recorded webinar was rendered relatively unusable. So, to reiterate a few things, the goals for the workshop and goals of this series of webinars is to provide a high-level view of what the CED is, what it can do, and how it might be or provide utility for you and your agency or organization. Looking at the outline spanning all three talks, we started in the first talk with an overview and background of the Conservation Efforts Database, how it came to be, why it came to be, what are some of the features and functions, how is the data used, and how the database has evolved from version 1 to version 2.1 and where we might go in the future. The second webinar talked about our threat-based structure, why we collect information in the way we do, and what are the things we're trying to speak to. We also took an in-depth look at data collection, primarily looking at the three types of information we collect: spatial, semi-spatial, and non-spatial, as well as the differences in the way we collect information on public lands versus private lands. If you'd like more information on those topics, I encourage you to go to the first webinar or the second webinar. In the third webinar, we'll be talking about reporting, taking a deeper look at what are some of the features and functions, as well as how the CED is coordinating and collaborating with existing databases and decision support tools. This is probably as good of a time as any to remind folks that on the CED help page, so at conservationefforts.org, or if you Google FWS CED, the Conservation Efforts Database should be the first hit. On that help page, we have tools for users, such as our user manual, which provides tables and documentation about all of the conservation actions we're collecting information on. It also talks about how to do things like register for a profile. We also have some recorded training videos on that, walking you through how to enter data, how to use the interactive map, and how to set up things like an approving official. But to get underway with this portion of the webinar, we're going to provide you a Nevada example now. Typically, we do a live demonstration of the tool, but because this is a webinar and we're going for a little bit of brevity, we've just done it through some screen captures here. So this is a screenshot of our interactive map. You'll see a bunch of multicolored polygons on the screen. Those are various conservation actions. The different colors represent different types of actions. Here you'll see pink is indicating that some habitat enhancements or post-disturbance restoration is occurring. Blue polygons typically refer to actions that protect or preserve sagebrush habitats, and the green are conifer removals. So what you'll notice here is when we just queried what's going on within the state of Nevada, on the left side of the screen you'll see that we have a quick summary. There are over 700 spatial records entered into this database, as well as 209 semi-spatial projects that you won't see on the map. And then we have 39 plans, strategies, and other non-spatial records that will not be represented. Once you conduct a query, you'll see at the bottom we have a tabular view of the information included in the query. Now, if you were to use your cursor to select any one of the polygons, you'll see that we have some quick high-level summary information that pops up in this text box. So for example, here we're looking at that small conifer removal. And again, we provide information about the activity, the subactivity, who the implementing party was. Now, as many of you know, very few conservation actions or treatments are done by one individual or one organization or agency. More times than not, there's some amount of collaboration. So when you see implementing party, it doesn't mean that they're the only party. And actually, within each record, you have an option to add who the other partners were that assisted in some way with that conservation action. What you see here, though, from a database perspective, is what agency or organization was responsible for providing that information. They become the go-to. So even if the state of Nevada perhaps had collaborated on this treatment, the BLM is the one that provided the information. And if we were to scroll down in that text box, you'll see some contact information to get a hold of the BLM in case you had more questions about a particular treatment. Additionally, what the CED does and what the interactive map does is provides context and the ability for you to look at other resource layers in context with the conservation action. So as an example here, we've turned on a greater sage-grouse breeding habitat layer developed by Kevin Doherty et al. You'll see the dark green is the higher quality breeding habitat, or a higher probability, I should say, of being breeding habitat. The lighter green is the second tier. So again, you can see where we have conservation actions occurring relative to that important seasonal habitat. We have a number of other layers, including things like habitat management areas, whether it's the BLM's priority habitat or a particular state's PAC or core layer, which again allows you to kind of see, are these actions happening in the areas that our partners have identified as the most important for sage-grouse conservation? Now, if you were looking this through the lens of a brewer's sparrow or a mule deer, perhaps these areas are important, perhaps they're not. And as new layers and other resource layers become available, we can add them into the CED's interactive map, so we can intersect conservation efforts data with those resource layers to provide additional context and to help assess the conservation benefit of these various actions. One of the changes we made, and I talked about this a little bit in the previous webinars, is now in addition to that quick summary, you have the ability to generate a more comprehensive report. So what you're seeing here is a screenshot of this new report. So if you were to select on it, a new browser window pops up. At the top is a map. So what you're seeing here is the user has identified having the population index along with the resilience and resistance layers captured in the Science Framework Part 1 and Part 2. You'll see in the upper right-hand corner of that screen grab that there's this opportunity to print this report to PDF. This is useful if you're trying to take information and insert it into your organization or agency's reports. You'll see that that report was generated April 18, 2019 and contains 41 efforts that total 22,000 acres. Doing a virtual scroll down on that same thing, you'll see that we have information on the amount of breeding habitat that was intersected with those. So again, this is just an example. And so what you're seeing here is the particular conservation actions that we queried. How do they overlap with that breeding habitat probability? Okay, so you'll see that less than a third, less than 20% actually occurred in the orange. The orange in this pie chart represents those lands that have the highest probability of being breeding habitat for greater sage grouse. The next tier, that 0.5 to 0.65 identified in red, looks like of the actions that we queried, a little bit over a third of them fell into that medium tier of breeding habitat. And then almost half of them actually fell below a 0.5 probability of being greater sage grouse breeding habitat. Again, going one more graph down. This is a layer pulled from the Science Framework Part 1, which merges that breeding habitat along with the resilience and resistance information. And again, we have another breakdown in terms of the percentage of actions that fall in each of those various tiers. So that's kind of I guess, a high-level overview of the type of reports that we can generate. Now, I'll also tell you that we have been working with state and federal partners to identify layers that might be relevant to a particular state, but that layer doesn't necessarily have a range-wide, a sagebrush range-wide coverage, and that's okay. We can still work with state partners to incorporate layers that are useful for them, and so in a particular summary, that information can be included. One of the things we've tried to improve upon over the last couple of years is increasing our ability to speak to other existing databases and decision support tools. So as I mentioned previously, whether it was in this webinar or webinar number 2, we have developed a process in which we create a geospatial web service feature so that spatial information shown on the CED's interactive map can be displayed in other data viewers and other decision support tools without ever giving the actual data to those other data viewers or decision support tools. On those other systems, the data cannot be manipulated, cannot be edited, as well as it gets updated when we update our data set. The other things we've done is created features like our batch upload feature. I talked about that a little bit in both the first and second webinar, but a little bit of an overview here is we have that batch upload template, which is a geodatabase, which allows data providers to take information in existing databases and transfer it into a geodatabase template. We then take the populated geodatabase template and we enter that information into the CED through an automated process for you. Then you, the data provider, enter the CED's user interface where you're actually sitting down in front of the computer, looking at your screen, and you have the ability to review what's been uploaded for you in your agency. What we talked about in the first webinar too was data security and access. So all of the data that is captured by the CED is password protected, and only we, the CED team, are the administrators and have access to that. So that's another way in which we keep the information secure. Now, I touched on it at the beginning of the first webinar here, where it says, well, who can use and access the data collected by the CED? And I said, well, the CED is open to the public and anyone can register for a profile. Various permissions can be granted based on the agency or organization that you're registered with. But the CED data is not readily available for download. However, over the last couple of years, we've been working with our partners to develop a process to access CED data. Now, you might be asking, well, what are people using CED data for? Well, they might be using it in things like landscape conservation design, where you're trying to prioritize or identify areas that you know, could benefit from some conservation or restoration action. Knowing whether or not there's been an existing investment or if there's an ongoing effort going on may influence where you cite future conservation actions. Additionally, when looking at the effectiveness of these conservation actions, over time, we may want to see where these conservation actions have resulted in increased sagebrush habitat quantity or quality, looking at various landscape scale metrics such as connectivity or patch size. Those analyses would be done outside of the CED, and so users may want to request that information. So the process for requesting that information is thus. Anyone looking for that information can develop a proposal outlining what they intend to use the data for and what products will be developed. Now, the CED team then looks at that proposal and identifies which partners, which data providers would be impacted by that request. Those requests are then put forth to an interagency team known as a range-wide interagency sagebrush conservation team, and they review it and decide whether to approve the request or deny it. If the request is approved, then we, the CED team, can package the requested data in a zip file and share that spatial information as well as the contact information for the original data providers. So it's a relatively new process. It's not as smooth as we'd like, but it's something better than nothing at this point. Now, I mentioned again that we can tailor collections and reporting based on partner needs. So the CED has always been developed to be flexible and adaptive to a number of monitoring requests. So we're constantly trying to work with other partners when they're developing their decision support tools and databases. If they're developing a database, we're happy to provide some background information to ensure that the two systems are compatible with one another. We really try to utilize the collect once, use multiple times model. And so if it's already being entered, if there's a way to reduce workload of having duplicate entry, as well as sometimes we work with folks and they're talking about developing tools for a specific need. The CED, to the best of our ability, tries to work with those tools so that we're not developing any redundant features unless that redundancy improves ease of use or accessibility. So with that concludes the third of this three-part webinar series. Again, these were intended to be course, high-level overviews, and we're also trying to summarize approximately 3 hours of really good, robust conversation into about an hour of combined webinar recordings. So, if you have any other questions or you're looking for other information, you can visit the CED at conservationefforts.org. Additionally, on the website, there's information to contact the CED team directly. So with that, thanks for your time and support of the CED, and we'll talk soon.